Well, hello, and welcome to my statutory in the heart of Scotland. Today I am going to be talking all about creativity and the importance of having that in your life. But mainly I'm going to be talking about the thing that changed my view on it and made it much more doable, much more achievable. It went from being something that would be nice to have, but I didn't think it would fit into my life, to being something that is right at the core. So I've got a dog sniffing my ankles here. Probably about 15 years ago now, we went down to London as a family. It was a half-term holiday, and we had rented an Airbnb in Hampstead. I'd chosen it probably because it had a tiny garden, and even if I'm only going to be there for a few days, I just like to have that kind of patch of green when I'm visiting London. So we went down, and it was in Hampstead, as I say, and there was this like big row of quite posh houses, and then down the side there was what would be called in Scotland a vennel. And if you saw my video last week where I had Kukubri, vennels there with little cottages, very, very common style. So this was like a little pedestrian path, overgrown pedestrian path. On the side was this row of small cottages. And right at the end was the one that we were renting. And as he handed the keys to us, the chap that was showing us around, who's called Gonzales, said, "Oh yes, these used to be where lots of artists lived in the 1930s. And I went, "Oh, that's really interesting. I'll do some Googling as soon as I get the internet code." And this block of, I suppose they're not really cottages, but living spaces, had been built. It's called Mal Studios. It had been built as kind of on-site studios for the big houses one street over. So artists would buy these very grand houses. This was 19th century. And then at the bottom of their garden, they would have somewhere to paint that had a different access, so that they could see sitters or people could come and view the paintings. And it would be separate from their house. But by the 1920s, those big houses didn't have artists in them. And in fact, they were being subdivided into flats. So this no longer kind of worked as a thing. And instead, artists began to rent these studios and to live in them, to live and work in them. So by the 1930s, all of this row of little spaces was inhabited by artists who are working and living in the spaces. And the reason that it attracted artists was that you go in from something that looks really small and quaint and cottagey into a big space with double height windows, really tall, and a mezzanine which was there to store paintings. So this space, it wasn't the tiny kind of cramped space that you would normally get in a small house, this kind of thing. It was a small space, but it was grand and it was full of light. So we were at number 7, which was right on the end, and when I googled, I found that the artist who stayed there was Barbara Hepworth. This was where Barbara Hepworth stayed before she moved to Cornwall. So, because she moved to Cornwall on the eve of the Second World War, so 1939. So right the way through the 30s, she stayed here. Now, Barbara Hepworth isn't just some artist who used to live here. She is, an international woman artist at the time when there were not very many. She is inspirational. She is like one of the greats. And I hadn't actually ever realised that she had started off her career in London, in Hampstead, and that her presence there kind of drew in lots of these other international artists to the Hampstead area. So, of course, once I found that out, I spent a lot of time on Google. I found that really the space hadn't changed very much. When she was there in the early, sort of like 1934, 35, she was beginning to get press attention. So there are photographs from that time of her in the house, and you could see exactly the same. The mezzanine was the same, the fireplace was the same, the door, the stairway, everything was recognisable from this space. But it was a small house that she was living in, because it had this one square room with the mezzanine, and then it had another room which was where maybe artists would have their clients wait, where the coats could be stored, that kind of thing, before they came in to inspect the paintings. And another small room that was the model's changing room. But that was it. And in being modernised for 21st century living, or 20th century living, it had, I have a dog, I'm just going to sort the dog out. Yes, in being modernised for 21st century living, it had, an indoor bathroom and a kitchenette and so on. But otherwise, it was very much the same. And then I started to just read a bit about Barbara Hepworth's life at the time. And when she was here, it was really a time of great change in her life. She was married, had a son who was about 4 when she got divorced. And she got divorced because she had started a relationship with Ben Nicholson, who was already married. And Winifred Nicholson, who I'm actually talking about next week, Winifred Nicholson, Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson, they attempted to have a very civilised setup where Ben would move between the households. And I don't think it was successful, and I think it caused a lot of grief to all of the people involved, apart from potentially Ben. But that was the situation, and it was kind of like decided amongst them, a Christian Scientist kind of influence on all of them, where they felt that the ego should be pulled back and that they should share and give Ben his freedom. So this was the situation. Barbara was living there with her son. She was sculpting. She was using like a coal hole that had been converted into a sculpture studio to do her work. And Ben was flitting between his 2 households. Then Barbara became pregnant. And this kind of caused some tensions within their triangle. But it was sort of like going along fine. Ben came back specifically for the birth of the baby. Turned out, my goodness, I think this must have just been so frightening, that it was not 1 baby, it was 3. Barbara Hepworth had triplets. Now, can you imagine that? There you are, you've got quite an unstable life. You're living pretty precariously. Single parent with somebody who's bobbing about between 2 houses, who has 3 children with his wife. You go into hospital, you're prepared for, another child, and suddenly you have 4 children. 3 triplets, obviously 3 triplets. You have triplets who are all low birth weight and not necessarily expected to survive, but certainly are going to need a lot of care, a lot of attention. So, Ben heads back to Paris to be near his other children, and Barbara is left trying to scrabble around to find care for the children. She seems to have, almost in a panic, realizing that her one room living here is not going to be suitable for, you know, three low birth babies and her 4-year-old and the nurses that she's going to have to employ to look after the babies. So she rents another space. She continues having this space at 7 Mile Studios, but she rents another space where she goes to live with the triplets, with Paul, with some nurses, with a cook. It's damp, it's a basement, it has no light, she's feeding them. It's winter, it seems to be always wet. She doesn't get to go outside with them because they're not able, you know, she can't take them out for a walk in the pram in case they get cold. She gets into postnatal depression. Hardly surprising. And her friends just say that, you know, they can't stop her from crying. You know, she just can't cope with this turn of life. So what appears to have happened is that a few of her friends started suggesting doing some investigations as to what would be a solution. And there was a nursery training school, Golders Green, where these 3 babies could go and be looked after with a nurse each in light-filled, warm spaces. And Barbara was convinced that that would be the best thing for the babies. So when they were 4 months old, they went to board at this nursery training school. Barbara could visit with Paul and with Ben when he was back in London. And there are lots of photographs from that period. Now, what is interesting is that in art history, this kind of framing of events has somehow come down that Barbara Hepworth was a terrible, cold mother who got rid of her infant babies so that she could concentrate on her work. And I think that nothing could be further from the truth when you actually read the letters, when you actually do reading around, when you move away from these very patriarchal, judgy kinds of things. So what happened next is that by the time they were 1, the triplets were back with her. She was at number 7, Mile Studios. Her friend, who was an art critic, whose name has escaped me, lived at number 3. And he said, look, you need to have more space than that. What we'll do is you can rent temporarily this space from me. He must have been doing his work somewhere else or be living somewhere else. We'll put in another mezzanine and you can have a nurse there to help you with the babies. And you can move all of the children in here and you to live here, and somebody can come in and help with the cooking, domestic things. You can keep the other space as your workspace. And from when the triplets were 1 until 1939, when she moved to Cornwall, that seems to have been the living arrangement. So she had sort of a space for living and working for herself, where the children would be during the day, and then she almost had like a night nursery. So she had, hope you can hear me with the rain, a divided thing which was 4 doors down. And she writes very, very fondly of this period. And she'd recovered from the postnatal depression. She changed her name by deed poll to Barbara Hepworth Nicholson. Lots of people thought that she got married in 1934, but she didn't actually marry Ben Nicholson until several years later. I'm going to stop here and wait for this rain to go off. So So it's abated a little bit, the rain. Hopefully you can hear me. This is, of course, why I have a statutory, so that I can be out here and I can get the daylight and a feeling of being outside, but I don't get wet. But it does mean that sometimes it's a little bit noisy. So I left Barbara Hepworth, 4 children, an intermittent partner, with 2 different living spaces, 3 cottages apart in this street. And there's a point to all of this story. But I say this also. Yesterday I was watching somebody talking about this period in Barbara Hepworth's life, and it was a woman, and she was talking about Barbara having rented or moved into this extra space with all the children. And she went, of course, she had a nurse and somebody to cook. And she said it in such a dismissive way, as though somebody should be expected to do everything themselves. And it did make me feel that we're sometimes our own worst enemies, and that judginess that society has, and often, and I really hate to say it, often the judginess is at its height with women. It just made me feel that kind of attitude is at the heart of so many of our problems in asking for help or taking help or delegating or just saying, yeah, you know what, I need to have some time of my own. The rain's all getting really heavy again. I think I'm going to have to just shout through it. So the point of all of this rambling story is to set up exactly how busy she was and how domestically focused one part of her life must have been. And yet it was at the same time that her art career continued to move up and become more international, and where she made lots and lots of breakthroughs. Now, the interesting thing for me is that when she's writing about creativity and this period particularly, but also her time in Cornwall, she is really clear that motherhood, domesticity, the real life living are at the heart of her creativity. They're what drive her forward, they are what inspire her, they are really what nest around her. So rather than having this idea that the pram in the hole is the enemy of promise, which is a very patriarchal kind of idea that if you want to reach your potential, then you can't have any kind of domestic responsibilities, which, you know, maybe Ben Nicholson was doing that. She is in complete contrast to that. And she talks of setting up music and toys and things for her children to do in her studio while she was working. And she also talks about how she needed to drive her work forward. She needed an hour a day to keep herself sane, to be working on something an hour a day. But if she couldn't get that, what she needed to do was to have done something creative every day. Now, she moved from doing sculpture to working in gouache and drawing, so that she could, that creative thing could just be a sketch before she went to bed at midnight. It could be arranging forms on the windowsill, like pebbles on the windowsill. It had many different forms, but her point was that it had to be every day. It had to be a habit. It didn't have to be grand. It didn't have to be finished. It didn't have to be any good. It wasn't a product, but you had to be doing it every day, because once you drop it, and she had dropped it in those weeks after she had triplets, hardly surprising, she found it very difficult to get back into thinking creatively, to pick up projects that had been begun before their birth, to kind of get herself back into the mindset. But she found that if she was creative every day, she didn't lose that thread. It was a thread running through everything. And the reason I'm telling this story is the thing that changed my attitude to creativity. Because before that, I tended to think, well, if it wasn't going to be big, or it wasn't something that I could share on my blog, or use to inspire people, or show off in some way, put towards an exhibition or a product or whatever. If it wasn't like that, it wasn't worth doing. Now, I'm never going to be Barbara Hepworth. Probably none of us around here are going to be, an artist of the kind of stature of Barbara Hepworth. But it is still so important that creativity is at the center of our lives, because creativity, expressing ourselves, finding out about ourselves, making something from nothing, decorating things, it is at the core of being human. And if we suppress that, or ignore it, or decide that we don't have time, we begin to miss something that is at the core of our essence. It's the essence of being human, is being creative in many different ways. I'm not saying it has to be, textile crafts or something. And I think that this idea of Barbara Hepworth, this experience that she had, where it didn't have to be grand, she didn't have to be doing sculptures, she could take it right the way down, but as long as it was every day, as long as it was the habit, the keeping of the thread, she would be fine. So that changed me. And now I do bigger projects, but I also always have something small and regular on the go. Mindful stitching, absolutely brilliant for that. One of these kind of things where you pick it up and you do 5 minutes and you put it down. And at the moment, hang on, let me find somewhere to put my coffee. Oops. So scissors on the floor. What I'm doing is a needlepoint cushion. So this is my needlepoint cushion, and all of these threads are the colours that I dyed with the food waste dye in the studio a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago maybe. And I'm going to be using this cushion as a record of the dyes that I do this year. But it means that each of these little squares, which is 15 stitches by 15, takes about 5 minutes. So whenever I've just got a spare 5 minutes, I can do one of those, or I could do a triangle that takes 2.5 minutes. And it's sort of gradually just building it up. And I think that there is going to be 100 squares in all. So it's going to be 100 times 5 minutes, which actually isn't really that much. It might be more than that. There might be more squares than that. That seems to be a little bit of an underestimation of the work. But, in 3 weeks, doing it just at odd times of day, I have got probably about a third of it done. And I will always have something like that on the go, It might be a knitted blanket, it might be socks, it could be anything, but as long as it's something that I am doing every single day. And this is something that I am now really passionate about helping other people do, just to bring that creativity back into their lives. And that's why I'm doing a masterclass on the 12th of June, which is a Thursday, and it's at 11 o'clock in the morning, UK time, so we're in British summertime. And I'm going to be just talking about different ways of putting creativity at the core of your life and making time for it without carving out great acres of time, or without it being difficult, really. Just sneaking things in and vastly improving your life. So that is on the 12th of June, as I say, and I will put the sign up link underneath here. I really hope that you can join us. It's free, and there will be a replay that I can send to everybody who signs up. So now the sun is out, the rain has stopped hammering on the roof of the situ tree, and I am going to probably go and do some weeding. So until next week, bye bye.